So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here, and this is another mechanical video. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to change the oil, fuel filter, and air filter on a 2017 Chevy 2500 HD with a Duramax diesel engine. However, this process will be the same for any Chevrolet 2500 or 3500 or GM 2500, 3500 with a Duramax diesel engine. I will also be showing you how to reset the oil and filter life as well in the instrument cluster. So here is a chapter index of what takes place at what times. So if you only need to see a part of this video, you can bypass what you don't need to see so I don't waste your time. So let's get to it. So something I do to keep the bottom of my truck a little cleaner is I tend to get a piece of cardboard or thick paper and bend it and tuck it up underneath the oil filter. Because if you do not, as you loosen the oil filter, that oil is going to go all over your cross member underneath it. And by putting that cardboard there, it basically gives it a slide to go directly into the drain pan instead of on your cross member. Another thing to think about is I always try and do the oil filter first. One of the main reasons for this is if I were to drain the oil first and then while I'm taking the oil filter off, it slips and comes out of my hand and falls into a full pan of oil, that's going to make a huge mess. And if you're doing this oil change right after it's been running, that oil is going to be very hot and not feel very good on your skin either. Whereas if I take the oil filter off first and I drop it into that pan, all I'm going to have is a thud and maybe a little bit of a mess. Another thing you want to make sure of is once you take that oil filter off, that the seal did not get stuck to the oil filter housing, because then there's a possibility of double sealing that and you will leak a bunch of oil when you go to start it. And if you say that'll never happen to you, I've actually seen it happen, and we had a trail of oil going out the front of our business that I worked for, and we had to call that guy back to the shop before he lost all his oil pressure. Now this is an actual picture of the new oil filter pointing to the seal, but this is just a reference. You want to make sure that that seal is in place on the old oil filter before installing the new one. Or just make sure you look up at the oil filter housing itself. Now I know this one looks like there's still something up there, but that's just the black used oil still dripping off of the filter housing. Another question I've heard a lot is whether to oil or not to oil the seal on the new oil filter when installing. I've personally changed out hundreds of filters, and honestly, it's probably a 50-50 split whether I put oil on the seal or not, and I've never had a problem either way. For example, when I put this one up there was still some of that residual old oil kind of dripping off the oil filter housing. So that actually lubricated the seal as I installed it. So I usually like to go pretty tight by hand and then maybe another quarter of a turn tight with a filter wrench. Now for the most part, if you go nice and tight by hand, that's probably pretty good for this size of filter. But actually at my work, I've had bigger filters actually start backing off and produce an oil leak if you do not get them tight enough. However, you don't want to get too crazy tightening them with a filter wrench either, because then you will fight them like crazy when you go to try and do your next oil change. The other thing I like to do, and this is more of an old school method of keeping track of your mileage and when the last time you did an oil change was, but I use a permanent marker and I write the date and the mileage on my oil filters. And that way I've always got that reference to see how long ago I did it and at what mileage. Not really necessary with this truck because it tells you when to do an oil change, but I still do it just as a habit. Using a 15mm socket on a ratchet, I removed the drain plug. If you're doing this with hot oil, I would definitely recommend using a glove because it does come out fast when it's hot. Now you will notice that pretty much every diesel engine is going to be nice black oil when it comes out. This is going to happen a couple hundred miles after you put new engine oil in, and that's perfectly normal on a diesel engine. That happens because of the high compression that a diesel uses to combust the fuel. Does push a little bit of that soot from the combustion down past the piston rings, which is then scraped off by the rings down into the crankcase. So according to GM, the torque spec for this drain plug is 62 foot-pounds. My torque spec was 3 elbow clicks or good and tight. The oil fill cap is on the driver's side of the engine, about middle of the valve cover. You do want to make sure you use the proper weight oil and that it is oil for a diesel engine. There is a difference due to the combustion process. Now I know this oil fill cap says 11 quarts, but it is closer to 10 quarts. You do want to buy this oil in gallons because it is cheaper that way. So I bought this truck off the company I work for, and I use the same oil that it's had in its engine its entire life, which is a Guard Oil ECT SAE 15W40 diesel engine oil. I bought 3 gallons of this oil. I put 2 full gallons in and then half of the last gallon, totaling 10 quarts. Then I checked the engine oil level on the dipstick to see if it was full. The engine oil dipstick is just to the left of the fill cap, a little bit lower down on the engine. You always want to have a paper towel or a clean rag to wipe off the initial oil on the dipstick and then put it back in and check it again. Once knowing that is reading full, then you are safe to start the engine. Once starting the engine, you want to make sure your oil pressure goes to the normal starting point, which should be somewhere around 60 psi. I'll usually let it run for about 5 to 10 seconds before shutting it back down and doing a final oil level check using the dipstick. The purpose of this is to let your engine oil filter fill with oil and make sure you are still reading at the right level. You want to be right at the top of this part of the oil dipstick. Make sure you do not overfill your engine oil because that can cause the crankshaft to hit the oil and aerate it, causing bad lubrication to your engine. Now a little bit overfilled isn't going to hurt you, but if you start going a couple quarts overfilled, then that's going to be a problem. To reset the oil filter life on your instrument cluster, you're going to turn the key to the on position. Use the up or down arrows on the right hand of the steering wheel to get to oil life. Use the right hand button to move over to the reset screen, press enter. Then it's going to ask you if you want to reset your engine life. Use the right hand button to move it over to yes, then press enter one more time, and you should be reading 100% oil life. Now I'm going to go over the fuel filter replacement. Now a normal position of this fuel filter is right in front of the diesel fuel tank on the driver's side underneath the bed. However, for my truck, we relocated it between the frame and the outside of the bed on the driver's side because I have a super large diesel fuel tank aftermarket in my truck. To change this fuel filter, you will either need a 36mm or an 1 7/16 socket. I do not recommend trying to use a crescent wrench or anything like that because this housing is plastic and will probably strip out if you don't use an actual socket to remove it. Now this is my first time changing this fuel filter since getting this truck, and it was put on a little tight. As you loosen the cap, there is going to be diesel fuel that spills out of it, so you do want to have a drain pan underneath to catch it. Eventually that fuel filter will stop dripping if you want to wait, or go ahead and keep loosening it until the cap is removed. Once the cap is removed, you will need to pull the fuel filter out just by pulling on it, and then using a screwdriver, remove the old O-ring. Here is a part number of the Chevy replacement filter. When you put the new O-ring on, you want to go around it with your fingers a couple times. That will remove any twists out of the O-ring. Then pop the fuel filter back in the same direction you took it off. There is an O-ring seal that goes in the cap, and you will have to push on it with some decent force to get it to pop into place. You should hear it pop when it is in correctly. You might want to put a little bit of fuel on that O-ring to help lubricate it. However, there's probably going to be a little bit on there from the residual diesel fuel anyways. Then just twist and tighten that down by hand as far as you can. Once it reaches the O-ring, there might be some resistance, so you might have to use a ratchet to tighten it down the rest of the way. Now this is way overkill as far as a ratchet goes to tighten this down, but it was the one I had from having to remove it because it was on so tight. A 3/8 ratchet should be plenty to tighten this down because the torque spec is only 25 foot-pounds. And then using some brake clean again and a paper towel, I went ahead and cleaned up that fuel filter housing cap so I don't get any mess in my garage. So this is the first year that they do use an electric lift pump in the tank to supply the engine. There is an 18mm cap on the fuel filter that you can loosen if you want to turn the key and prime it that way until fuel starts coming out. However, this really isn't necessary. If you just cycle the key a couple times, you might have a little bit of a long crank, but it should fire on its own without a problem. Once cycling the key a couple times, go ahead and crank it. If it doesn't start for whatever reason, repeat that process. Once it starts, you can also hold it at 1,000 RPMs to work any air that's possibly still trapped in the system. But usually with that electric fuel pump, this isn't really a problem either. To reset your fuel filter life on your instrument cluster, you're going to turn the key in the on position, then using the up or down arrows on the right-hand side of the steering wheel, go to where it says fuel filter life. Then press the right-hand button to get to the reset screen and the center button to reset the fuel filter life. When it resets, it should beep and go to 100%. Now this was already reading 100% because my first video of this, when I was resetting it from the 6%, was a little blurry, so I just redid it. One thing I would like to add is make sure you dispose of your oil and oil filters properly. Don't just throw them in the garbage. Any place that you bought your oil or oil filter from most likely is going to be able to take that oil free of charge. Even Walmarts will take up to 5 gallons per day, even if you did not buy the oil through them. So I actually had this roll around pan that I used to do the oil change, and then I just dumped it into a sealable container. The other thing I've done in the past is after filling the oil up on the engine is just use a funnel and put it back in the gallon jugs that I used to fill the engine and dispose of it that way back to the place I bought the oil from. In order to inspect your engine air filter, you're going to need a 5/16 nut driver or a flathead screwdriver to remove the 2 screws that hold the air filter cover to the housing. You will also need to remove this hose clamp on the air filter cover as well to give you enough room to access the air filter. The wiring harness for the mass airflow sensor is long enough where you can pull it out of the way. There might be a couple clips you might have to remove to give you enough slack to move the cover out of the way. You can also unplug that mass air sensor if you want. There's a little red clip that you have to pull back. Then there's a black button that you have to push down and pull at the same time to get that harness off of the mass airflow sensor. Once inspecting the air filter and realizing it wasn't that dirty, I just decided to take my blowgun and blow it out. You do want to go from the clean side to the dirty side when blowing it out, not from the dirty side through to the clean side. Either way, whether you blow it out or put a new one in, it will only fit in the housing one way. When installing the cover, there are 3 tabs you need to make sure get aligned properly, because that is what holds the bottom part of that cover tight to the air filter housing so you do not get any dirt past it. An improperly installed air filter is probably one of the easiest ways to absolutely destroy an engine. You can get the boot back on the cover and tighten that hose clamp down, and then slide those 3 tabs from the bottom of the cover down into place. And then go ahead and put the 2 screws in the top and tighten those down. Keep in mind those 2 screws are going into plastic, so they don't need to be tightened down with a lot of force. Otherwise you might strip them, and then once again you do not have a good positive seal to protect your engine. And that's all there is to changing your air filter. If you did choose to unplug your mass airflow sensor, all you have to do is push that connection back on tight until you hear it click. Then go ahead and push that red locking tab in until you hear it click as well. The reason I try and leave mine hooked up is because the more and more you mess with these connections, the more likely you are to possibly break either the red locking tab or the pigtail itself, because these things do get dried out and brittle over time with the heat of the engine, etc. So real quick, I'm going to go over the other fluids in the engine compartment. Right here you have your overflow bottle for your coolant, and then your fill for your DEF fluid. On the driver's side of the engine compartment, you have the transmission fluid dipstick, which you check with warm oil while it is running. You also have your power steering fluid, your windshield washer fluid, and your brake fluid in the master cylinder. Every fluid under the hood should be done with the engine off except for the transmission fluid. That once again should be running with warm oil to check it. Hopefully this video helped you out, guys, and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Later.